Okay, looks like we are live. Greetings, my fellow primates watching this, whether you be theist, atheist, religious, or secular. My name is Shane the Skeptic, and I'm joined today by David Ramsey. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Shane.
Yeah, you're welcome. I want to mention, David Ramsey, he's the author of the new best-selling book, Speaking of God, We Don't Know Shit. He's also spent 10 years as a Baptist minister and around a decade studying religion at some of the most prestigious academic institutions. These include Duke and Princeton. David, what was it like spending so much time being involved in that?
Well, I enjoyed being a student. I've enjoyed being a student, regardless of the subject. But I grew up in a religious home and family. Faith was always at the center of my life. But when I decided to pursue the study of religion at Wake Forest, where I did undergraduate work, it was with no ulterior design to be a minister or even to take my studies even further. I was going to go to law school, and my academic advisor said, you can major in anything, and I enjoyed the subject of religion. So I majored in religion. I was president of my fraternity. It was said when I decided to go to Duke Divinity School that our fraternity faculty advisor had his first heart attack because I was not the typical Baptist student. I wasn't a member of the Baptist Student Union, but I was religious, and faith was very important to me. I would be one of the guys that would get up on Sunday morning hungover, but would go by myself to church. So faith was always, but no, it was always, I enjoyed the academic study because it put into context, the stories that I had been taught as a child, but in a much different context, in a context that would eventually lead me to abandon my faith and abandon Christianity.
Okay, yeah, that's really something. There's a lot to go on there, but that reminds me when you mentioned like you would show up to church hungover. I remember back when I was a Christian, a lot of people had, they would talk about on Friday, they would say, all right, I'm going to get shit-faced the next 2 days and then go make up for it on Sunday. It was just this kind of idea that like every week I'm going to go do the same thing on Friday and Saturday, and then I'm going to go on Sunday and I'm going to go apologize to God for it.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really think that that was something.
Yeah, you didn't seem like one of those, but
no, I didn't think there was anything to be forgiven for. Mm-hmm. But I'll tell you, Shane, a funny story. I don't think I've shared this on any of the podcasts. So, in my second church as a senior minister, our church organist was a professor at the local college. He taught French, and he had taken the Sunday off, and he had gotten another professor who played the organ to volunteer for him to step in. And when we were getting ready to go out into the sanctuary, I thought I smelled alcohol on the organist's breath. And when we got into the service, I realized that he may have been more than hungover. He started playing either the doxology or the Glory Patri, and it was so off base, I had to stop.
Oh man!
And look at him and say, "Hey, can we start over with this? I think we're a little off." I actually found that humorous. But at least I can honestly say I never showed up hungover or drunk when I was a minister to preach.
Well, okay, I would have to say that if I am the person ministering in a church, the organist is the last person I want showing up drunk or hungover. They're going to be the first. That's the most noticeable person to come in drunk.
Yeah, I can
ever think of.
Yeah, I can tell you. So I never preached drunk or hungover, as far as you know.
As far as I know. All right. Well, that makes a lot of sense. So you said it was around 1996 when you left. What was it that you left first?
Yeah, I walked away from ministry. I was
okay.
a senior. Yeah, I was senior minister of a 700-member congregation in Virginia. And I walked away. I had no job. I started my life over. I did not know what I would do, but I knew that I could no longer be a minister with the worldview that I had come to embrace, which is essentially agnosticism.
Okay, well, that makes a lot of sense. That does bring us into the next thing that I wanted to talk about, because I noticed in your book, right before the beginning of chapter 1, you talked about, this is in the introduction of the book. You say that I hadn't become an atheist Not that there's anything wrong with that. I was more of an agnostic, and the terms here are important. An atheist, by definition, denies the existence of God. By contrast, a theist is someone who believes in a God. An agnostic says simply that we don't know and can't know if there is a God. I'll say more about this later in the book, and I'm very happy that you did. But you say basically right after that, the last part I'll read is you say, I found agnosticism to be an intellectually honest worldview. None of us really knows if there is or isn't a God. We may believe or hope in a God, but we do not know. And that's huge. That's a huge step for somebody who is a Christian theist to come to get to the point where you realize that you don't know. And I think that it seems like your definitions slightly become more compatible with mine later on in the book, but I wanted to talk about this. So I remember reading an atheist by definition denies the existence of God. And anytime I read that in a book, I just instinctively get a pen and I circle it and I'm like, hold on a minute, here's an error. Because for me, theism is the belief in at least one God, right? And as you know, adding an A at the beginning of a word means the absence of. So when we have morality, we have the opposite of morality, which is immorality, but then we also have the absence of morality, which is amorality. So to me, everybody's an agnostic. Not everyone really admits that, but not everybody knows that they're an agnostic. Some people believe that they know there's a God or that they know that there isn't one. These would be called hard theists or agnostic theists or Gnostic atheists as well, or hard atheists as well. And I'm in the camp of agnostic atheists, where I agree with you. We cannot know. The question comes down to whether or not you believe. What would you have to say about, I guess, my interpretation of these terms that I just gave?
Yeah, I wouldn't quibble, over the terms, Shane. I took a risk in the book of trying to delineate what, I saw as the difference. And it certainly is not a textbook. My definitions were not textbook, but
Right.
they were simply a way for me to tell my reader, this is kind of where, I landed. Do I believe that there is a God? No. Do I leave open the possibility that there could be a God? Yes. But at a minimum, I don't know. And I don't think we can know. And then the thing that really crystallized for me and that really kind of forced me to walk away from ministry was I became comfortable with not knowing. And I really thought that was a place that was incompatible with where many in my congregation were. Although I will tell you this, after I announced my resignation, I was kind of cryptic from the pulpit. I did not even use the terms agnostic or atheist, but I had some members that came by my office and closed the door and said, "Okay, why are you really leaving?" They didn't believe me. They thought somebody was off. And I said, "No, let me unpack this for you a little bit more." And I had several. In fact, no one said, "I'm glad you're leaving." The ones that came by said, "You could have stayed." I'm comfortable with that worldview. But for me, it was an issue of integrity. I felt like that my local church and even the larger church with a capital C probably wanted someone with more certainty, and that was not me.
Yeah, it could actually be pretty if you're trying to keep people in belief, it could be pretty detrimental to your goal to allow a person to preach who isn't very confident themselves. So,
well, Shane, to be clear, I never saw my role as an apologist for either God or for Christianity. I was not one of those ministers. In fact, I would often take scholarship into the pulpit. And one Easter Sunday, I actually deconstructed the resurrection of Christ in a sermon. And I said, like this, there's another side to this story. And most of you don't know it because no one has ever brought it into the pulpit. But if you are a believer, you need to know the other side of the story. If you're going to be an apologist and a defender of the faith, you need to understand the other side of the argument. And I use the analogy of an attorney. No attorney would go into a courtroom not knowing and understanding the theory of the case of his opponent. You just wouldn't do that. It would be malpractice. And I would always say to my congregations, I would remind them of what Socrates said about an unexamined life is not worth living. I would often say an unexamined faith is not worth having. And I applied that to myself. I would always read things that didn't necessarily jive with a Christian worldview. Some of that was introduced to me in graduate school, but I found those books on my own because I wanted to challenge myself to make sure.
We lost him for a second. I should go back on. Uh-oh.
Yeah.
All right. You're back on. You were your camera froze for a minute there, but okay.
Yeah,
so
at the end of the day, I wanted to be clear that faith, it has to be yours. It can't be your mom's or dad's or your family's faith. It could be, but it's blind. It's something that I think you have to own. And to own it, I think you have to understand all sides of that faith. Whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Christian, whether you're a Muslim, I think it's important to know where the arguments are on the other side. And all religions have those kind of weaknesses.
Absolutely, especially when you consider the fact that not only could it simply be the case that your religion is wrong, it could also be the case that some other religion out there has it right. And it would really suck if you ended up going to Muslim hell because you never actually took the time to learn about what Islam is because you were just so fulfilled with Christianity,
Yeah, and if you say, hey, my faith is blind and I accept it like that, that's fine. Good for you. But don't in the next breath dismiss someone else's faith or belief system if you haven't examined yours and if you don't understand where the arguments on the other side of your faith are.
Yeah, I've actually heard this saying. A lot of people say this in church. They go, "Well, evidence. If you had evidence, you wouldn't be able to have any faith." So they kind of have this idea that you have to not have evidence and believe without that evidence in order for you to qualify to get into heaven, because God needs you to believe without evidence for him to be happy. If he waits till the moment you've been given evidence, well, then it's too late. You didn't have enough faith. And it's kind of like you talked about in your book, like any God like that isn't really a God worth worshiping.
Yeah, that's a great point, Shane. I reached a conclusion with whatever God there is or isn't. And I said, if there's a God, and that God can't handle my intellectual rigor and my intellectual honesty. And by the way, that's the same God that gave me a brain that allowed me to arrive at that conclusion. If there is a God and that God can't handle my intellectual honesty, that's not much of a God. That's a small God, not a God worth worshiping. And that's kind of where I ended up. And I sleep very well at night, having reached that peace with whatever God there is or isn't.
Yeah, it's kind of similar to the position that I had shortly after becoming an atheist, and having some, I don't know if this makes sense, but doubts about atheism, where you're like, okay, but am I wrong for not believing? And you start considering it. And I came up with a very similar take on it. And my take was that if there is a God, because people go, what would it take for you to believe? Well, if there's a God and he knows everything, he knows the answer to that question. I don't have to tell you what would it take for me to believe in a God. What I can tell you is that if there's a God who's omniscient, he knows whatever the answer to that question is. And if he's omnipotent, then he's capable of doing it. Now, you believe God has a plan. Maybe you should be willing to grant the possibility that it's not part of God's plan for me to believe in his existence. Maybe it's part of his plan for me to be an atheist. Or, seems a little bit more likely, maybe that God doesn't exist. And that's kind of where I ended up going is, okay, people keep warning me, like, if this God's real, and I just keep thinking, like, okay, if he's real and wants me to believe and is capable of convincing me, well, then, yeah. And I made an analogy in one video where I said, if I had a cup and it was filled with hot coffee, and I wanted to convince you that there was hot coffee in the mug, you can deny, you can doubt, you can not believe me when I say it. But when I splash a piping hot cup of coffee in your face, doubting its existence becomes impossible for you. You don't get to choose whether you believe the cup had coffee in it or not when your face is burnt by it. And then I said, now think of any Christian that you know. Don't you think that by now one of them would have splashed you in the face with a piping hot cup of Jesus if they could? And I thought that was the best way I could put it, is if they had what could convince me, think about how much they want me to believe. God wants me to believe, and he's capable of it. He's not doing a good job, and he's not sending anyone who's really that good at apologetics to do so. So I guess I see that similar to what you said.
Yeah, I would take that cup analogy, but I would say that's not God in the cup. I would say it's probably something more along the lines of my title. No, it's just fascinating how people, are just so impassioned to convince you that there is a God.
Mhm.
And when I walked away from the ministry, the other kind of piece that I made with God was, look, I've spent, a lot of my life, good earning years, as a matter of fact, being a defender of the faith, or at
Right.
least pointing others to what I thought was you. I'm going to let you do that. You're plenty capable. If you're God, you should be able to do that without the help of someone like me.
Yeah.
But it's just, I'm always fascinated by how much how much people know about God. And there was a saying when I was a kid in some evangelical circles, I know that I'm saved. And
Yeah.
as a kid, that always struck me as odd. When I reached my own conclusions about that matter, I said, I don't know. And I am comfortable with not knowing, but no one knows, and no one knows that they know. That was almost a way of just trying to double down on certainty when I don't think there's any certainty.
Yeah, I think that's something that bothered me the most, especially shortly after becoming an atheist. It wasn't that there were people who believe in a God, it's that they insist that they know that there is one. And not only that they know that there is a God, that they know which God, and that they know what that God has in plan for them. It's like, how do you know you're not going to hell? You could say you believe you're going to heaven, but when someone says that they know for a fact they are not going to hell, I just can't really see them as being, it's hard for me to view them as being intellectually honest. I'm sure they're being honest with me, but are they being honest with themselves for them to actually say that they know they're going to go to heaven?
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. One of the things that I do in the book, Shane, both heaven and hell are
oh,
literary.
could you your mic cut out for a second. You said one of the things you did in the book, and then it cut out. What did you say after that?
Yeah, I set out to examine the literary concepts of heaven and hell, and I essentially conclude that they are nothing more than literary concepts. For example, in the Old Testament, if you had asked someone in the Old Testament times if they were going to heaven or hell, they wouldn't have known what you meant, because there wasn't a word for hell. The Hebrew word for afterlife was Sheol, and it was believed that everyone went there. It was the shadowy, nebulous, either place or state of being. It's not until you get to the New Testament that you see that the Greek word for hell, Gehenna. Well, Gehenna was a garbage pit outside of Jerusalem where fire smoldered and garbage burned. They used to sacrifice kids there. And so when Jesus said it would be better for someone to be thrown into Gehenna than to mislead, a child, people would have said, "Oh, I don't want to go to Gehenna." But no, you can trace the literary evolution of those concepts and see their origins. And but at the end of the day, even if they do point to a reality, which I don't think they do, I'm as agnostic about the afterlife as I am about this life and this God. I don't know. I've not met someone who's come back after dying. I'll be glad to entertain, that conversation if and when that occurs. I don't know what happens when we die. I don't think anything does. I think that's it. But in my moment of faith, and I do have moments where I ponder and wonder, do I hope that, one day I get to see my mother and father who have died? Absolutely. I think that would be a beautiful reunion. Do I think it's going to happen? No. But I write in my epilogue about when I was writing my book, my mom died unexpectedly. And so I was tasked with planning her funeral. I delivered the eulogy. And you might be surprised, I chose scripture. Her grandchildren read scripture. I chose music that she liked, and music that deeply moves me to this day. Will the Circle Be Unbroken was a song that was actually a video I showed. Do I believe in the intellectual premises of those songs? Hell no, I don't. but do I find comfort in them? And do they move me to tears? Absolutely.
And it's also, it was your mom's funeral, and it's what she would have wanted. So I think that it was right of you to give your mom the kind of funeral that she would have wanted, rather than the type that you would have liked to give. So
yeah, in the eulogy, my eulogy was I actually used the Andy Griffith Show as kind of the scaffolding to tell her story. But I was very faithful to my own integrity in terms of my belief system. But I can be moved by religious songs. I can be moved by hymns of my childhood. But I don't have to believe in the underlying premises of them. And I can hold those two things in my head at the same time.
definitely. I mean, I can find myself emotionally invested in a movie that I'm watching, and that doesn't have to mean that I think the movie is, based on a true story. It's like, yeah, I know that these Pixar characters are all just a bunch of animated animals, but that one just lost its son, so I'm sad. And when it comes to religion, it's actually, a lot more emotional than that, because apart from that similarity, these are songs that you had previously sang while you believed in it, right? So you were familiar with the song, and I know a lot of people who are former Christians, whether they be atheist or just secular theists. A lot of them, when they hear certain songs that they remember from church and they remember the way that they felt when they sang them, some of them are still brought to tears by it. And I'm sure there are plenty of people out there that go like, see, you still have faith. You're crying at the song, but no, it's just because it's a good song, or it's an emotional song, and it's something that you at least at one point related to. And yeah, that's certainly understandable. I am very sorry to hear about your mother passing, and I commend the way that you went about her funeral. I would have had a very difficult time partaking in the religious part of a funeral, because the way that I became with my family, when I first deconverted, I wasn't as passionate about this, where if everyone prayed, to say grace, I would like hold hands with everyone, close my eyes. But I realized at a certain point that I felt like I was doing something dishonest by doing so. And I felt like, if I don't want to be dishonest with my family should respect that I don't want to pretend to believe in their God to make them feel better. We should have an open relationship where I will wait for them to say grace first. I won't start eating before they say it, because it's their house, it's their tradition, whatever. But I guess I still have a difficult time partaking in anything that's religious. And
Yeah.
there are events like this funeral that you did where something like that happens. And I think you made the right call.
Well, I think I'm like you though in every other respect, with the exception of my mom's funeral. If I'm in a room and a prayer is foisted upon me, I don't close my eyes and I don't pray, and I may even leave the room. So I'm as principled as you about that, because I don't want someone else forcing on me their behavior, and I just simply don't participate. But in the case of my mom, to your point, it was about her. And I wanted to create a service that would be fitting of her life.
Yeah.
But I don't think that I compromised my intellectual integrity.
I don't think you did either.
To maintain it. But I guess you made a great point about watching a movie being moved to tears. Emotion is not the sole provenance of religion.
Right.
I can be moved by a good book. I can be moved by a movie. I can be moved by a song, whether it be religious or not. You can make the argument that those kind of emotions are transcendent and spiritual, and I would nod at that, but I stop there. There are days when I'll contemplate the universe, or I'll contemplate the brain, or even a simple tooth and its structure, and I'll be moved to awe and wonder, but I stop there. I stop there and I bow before either the unknown God or gods, or the gods that don't exist, and just simply say, this is awesome, or this is wonderful. And I stop there, and I'm fine with stopping.
Yeah, it's a lot of people have a very hard time when, they keep asking questions, getting answers, asking questions, getting answers. And eventually you get to that point where there's a question and the answer just becomes, I don't know. And some people, when they hear the words, I don't know, they think, well, that person's stupid. You get asked a question, you go, I don't know. Oh, well, that person doesn't know anything. Well, there are some questions that the only intellectually honest answer to is, I don't know. So you could ask me if I believe one way or the other, but if you ask me, do I know? Like, I'm gonna have to be honest here and say, no, I don't.
And you've just essentially, you've captured the essence of my book. We don't know. No one knows.
We don't know.
No one knows. We don't know. We don't know shit.
Now, when it comes to, I guess, people saying, do we go somewhere after we die? And I've always said, I don't know. I am, while I'm not a hard atheist, I guess I have been finding myself slightly more confident in not only the lack of a belief that we go anywhere, but in the belief that we actually don't. And one of the reasons why I'm kind of leaning more toward this now is we can look at how a brain works. We can explain psychologically and, through neurology, like what is going on. You have, these chemicals, you have this, I guess we could say electricity, you have neurons moving around. And when this activity stops, so does your consciousness. And it seems very easy to make out. We have the cause of your consciousness, and that is your brain and its activity. And the effect of that is your consciousness. So when that cause comes to an end, why would we not think that its effect would come to an end as well?
I think that's a very compelling argument, and I'm with you. And I could not, I couldn't even put a finer point on that. It's well said, and that's kind of where I landed because it makes sense. It's reasonable.
Yeah. So something good to go over there. Let's talk about this part of your book because you brought up something by Christopher Hitchens where you said, and because we look at religion, Christianity is obviously what we'll spend the most time talking about today, but this is something that applies to really every religion, is we see that religion was the race's first and worst attempt to make sense of reality. It was the best the species could do at a time when we had no concept of physics, chemistry, biology, or medicine. We believed that sprites, imps, demons, and jinns were hovering in the air about us. We imagined that thunder and lightning were pretentious. It has taken us a long time to shrug off this heavy coat of ignorance and fear, and every time we do, there are self-interested forces who want to compel us to put it back on again. And that is kind of a point that I touch on a lot, where the people who wrote this were reasoning with the information that they had, which was a hell of a lot less than the information that we have today. So when you go, well, how do we explain diseases and plagues? We have to come up with an explanation for it. And you don't have the germ theory, you're going to arrive at something very different than anything that a modern scientist is going to arrive at today. And when I look at, the ancient understanding of the world, especially just the book of Genesis, we look at it, and 2 verses in, we see an error. We see God creating the earth, and he hasn't created a sun yet. And we can actually prove, when we look at our solar system and the formation of it, we can look at how solar systems form. Well, the sun, being the largest object in it, would have had to exist, prior to the earth. And I guess now that we have that understanding, when you propose this explanation of the beginning of the universe, and now we look at it and we go, okay, we see that you thought Earth came first, made sense at the time, but now we know a lot more. And now we know that your book is imperfect because we've already established an error 2 verses in.
Yeah, I that's one of my favorite Hitchens quotes, that because it was our first attempt to explain the world, it was our worst, and it absolutely was our worst. And I agree with him there. And I would even extend that to say that the writers at that time, their understanding of the universe was probably less than my daughters when they were 12 years old.
Yeah.
So think about that. But then there are those, and I was in that camp that saw the Genesis story as myth, and a beautiful myth. I mean, but there were flood stories were a dime a dozen back then. The Gilgamesh epic was the Babylonian flood story. So, my churches and the people in them, and even my peers, probably did not read the book of Genesis literally. They saw it as myth. But again, it's one thing to say it's myth and to try to find meaning in that. Joseph Campbell did a great job of that in his seminal The Power of Myth. But yeah, the people that wrote all the Bible. I mean, if you even take the latest book of the New Testament, which, sometime after 100 AD, even their understanding of the world and the universe was just minuscule compared to what we know today.
Absolutely. And I guess we can't blame them for arriving at the wrong conclusions back then. But when we talk to people who are, living in this age where they have Google, I mean, I don't know if I should just leave it at that. We have Google. You have access to biology. You have access to astrology. Not astrology. Not astrology. I meant to say astronomy. I'm very glad I heard myself and corrected myself. I do not believe in any astrology, but we have all this understanding now, and we can actually reason based off of it, and we're getting a lot farther. Looking at the ancient attempts, like I said, not blaming people for believing it back then, I remain a little bit stuck as to how some people can believe in the Bible today. And I guess the question is really answered, like you were saying earlier. We have to teach it to kids when they're young before they develop critical thinking skills. And as long as you get a bias developed in them in that belief at a young age, if it becomes a strong enough bias that they never intellectually, honestly question it, then they may remain a believer for the rest of their life.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I make the argument in my book that I think one of the most insidious sides of religion is the indoctrination of children. And I don't care whether it's a liberal, Protestant Christianity or the most conservative. You're taking kids whose brains are fertile, they've not developed critical thinking skills, and every week you're pounding into those young, fertile brains, things that simply aren't true or that we know. And I say in the book, you give me a child, say starting at the age of 3 or 4, you give me that child one day a week, 52 weeks of the year, I will create an elaborate mythology in which the sun is God, the moon is God's wife, and the stars are God's children. And I'll add a whole bunch of other stuff to that. And by the time that kid is 10 or 11 or 12, they will believe that mythology. And to your point, that's such a part of their personhood. But by the time they're adults, to challenge that is to challenge them.
Yeah.
And, we haven't moved that far from what Hitchens would call our worst attempt to explain the world. Just look at the anti-science movement today that led to calling COVID a hoax and the climate change deniers. Science is the enemy. But I can't remember which writer said this. It might have been Sam Harris, but it's pretty provocative. So let's just take all of the mythologies and religious stories of the world and erase them. Just erase them from the books and do the same with science and start over. At some point, you're going to reach the same conclusions with science that we have today, but your stories are going to be totally different. And there will likely be stories. Nature abhors a vacuum, so there probably would be other myths that would fill that void. Science are going to arrive at the same place. The stories are going to be altogether different.
Exactly. If we could take the Bible, the Quran, whatever, and erase it entirely, it would never come back the same way that it was. But, if you hide our understanding of science, the laws of physics are still going to be the laws of physics, and therefore we will still discover them to be the same thing that they are. So, that point remains valid, I think. It's pretty simple. You wouldn't be able to recreate that, but with science you can, because we can test and observe these things. And that's why I'm able to trust scientists. When I talk about trusting scientists, a lot of people often accuse me of, oh, well, isn't that making an argument from authority? And a lot of people fail to understand it. Trusting the conclusions of experts isn't making an argument from authority. An argument from authority would be, this expert said this, so it's true. But when we're to look at, for example, like you mentioned climate change, when I can see that 97, it's between 97 and 98, it might still be at 97% of scientists, they believe that climate change is real and it's man-made. Well, in order for it to be the case that 97% of scientists think that, this has to be tested, replicated, verified, observed. This is something that we actually have to prove. And it makes it a lot more valuable to me to go, okay, it's a peer-reviewed journal. It was reviewed. Someone had to test it and prove it. Not just say, I think this is how things work. They had to prove that that was how it worked and rule out false causes and stuff like that. So definitely onto something there.
Yeah, I think the most important thing you just said is, I mean, science is not a belief system. It's not a matter of belief.
Right.
You know, it's hypotheses that have been tested and proven, and doesn't require belief. But yet, so many talk about, do you believe it? Do you believe in science? It's the wrong terminology. It's the wrong vocabulary. Science is not something to be believed.
Yeah, and I think it kind of exposes an issue with a belief system that you have. If you have this idea that science is just another belief system, you have something fucking wrong with your belief system. You should be able to go, okay, I have my belief system and you have yours. Let's use science to see who is correct. Not like, okay, well, I have homeopathy and you have science. Well, I mean, why is your science any better than homeopathy? It's interesting because if those same people believe that science supports their side, all of a sudden they're the biggest fans of it. If somebody believes that science proves the existence of God, they love science. They try to use science to support their conclusion. Okay, but what happens if science doesn't agree with you? It's another belief system.
Yeah.
It's fucking incredible to watch. Not incredible in a good way.
I know.
Watching somebody go through that, like you said. Yeah. You mentioned there's a chapter in here, and I mean, the chapter title is almost self-explanatory, but obviously worth discussing. The God who protects until he doesn't. I like that a lot because a lot of people have this idea of a God who's going to look out after them, or they say, God's going to keep me safe when I do this. And then something bad happens to them, and you don't even see them like reconsidering or thinking about it. And it reminded me when I had first moved to Texas. I went to one of my cousin's football games. And before the game, they held a prayer at the school, which I'm pretty sure is against the law, but whatever. They held a prayer at the school praying for the football players to all be safe in the game. Because every once in a while, if you get enough people to pray, God takes a break from giving children malaria, and he just comes and protects the players of your football game. But what made this interesting was that 2 people got injured during the game and had to be taken out on stretchers. I didn't hear one question of faith. I didn't hear one person say like, isn't it weird that we prayed specifically for no one to get injured in this game? And now after the game where 2 people were injured, we're all thanking that God for looking out after us. I'm sitting there and I'm just stuck on how anyone could believe this.
Yeah, I stopped counting after the number of times I would be asked to pray before a football game when I was a minister. I just wouldn't do it for that and so many other reasons. But yeah, I found, Shane, in my experience as a minister and even as just an adult, faith for many people is a belief in a divine protection system. And for the most part, it gets existentially reinforced. Most of us were born, we grow up, some of us marry, some of us have children, we have a career, and we die. And often without any tragedy or fanfare. And so the notion that God protects gets existentially reinforced. But when that belief system is challenged, I've seen it absolutely erase the boards of believers. And I actually had a peer when I was a minister who believed that God had put a hedge around his family. And he would cite that both of his grandparents were alive, his parents were alive. And he interpreted that as a reason to be a minister. And he was giving back to God for protecting him. And I always found that to be incredibly primitive, incredibly narcissistic. And I would say, what would happen if one of your children died? And he would then honestly say, it would erase my board.
Yeah, and then for people like that, it's like, okay, but you're aware that other people have had their kids die, right? So if your kid dying would cause you to not believe in God, why does like kids dying not do that for you? You know that other kids die. It has to be yours to shake your faith.
Yeah,
but,
we talked about this, Shane, before we came on the air. Anytime, someone, points to, God's miracles or God's intervening, I say, while you and I are having this conversation, 100 children today will die of cancer in the United States. 100.
Yeah.
But your God is so powerful that he can protect football players in a game, or that he can come through and deliver something that you've asked for at.
Yeah. Looks like it went out again. It does that. Okay, your camera stopped again.
Okay.
What was the last 10 seconds of what you said?
Yeah, I just said, to me, when anyone boasts of God answering a prayer or asks God for something that I would consider trivial, which actually asking God for anything seems that to me, but 100 children every day die of cancer. But 100, as we're talking, 100 children die of cancer. That God, if that's your God, and if there is a God, that's a small God. That's a really weak God, because if you're going to lift a finger to do anything in your God, you're not going to let 100 children die, let alone one.
Right. The priorities seem a little bit out of whack, that he would actually allow all those children to die of malaria, cancer, etc. But then he's going to look out for your broken ankle. I mean, you don't have a broken ankle because of God, but what do you tell this person who just lost their kid? And I've thought about this, where it's like, surely this has to have happened where you have two people in a car, maybe drunk driving, the teenagers, a little younger than me, whatever. Car accident, one of them dies, one of them doesn't. Both of them have Christian parents, right? And what's going to happen is you're going to have the Christian parents of the survivor thank God for protecting their kid. And they seem to not realize that that implies that God was not protecting the kid right next to him that just died. It's like, wow, our kids just got in an accident and mine survived. Thank you, God, for protecting my kid. Yep. It's like a lot of people fail to realize that really comes off as a fuck you to the other kid. It's like, all right, well, for whatever reason, mysterious ways. Or, like you said, it was his time. There's an ever-moving goalpost, and that's another chapter that you have.
But it actually is a good segue, because the other side of that same coin is, why do you even need to pray to God to heal someone or to make something better? If God's omniscient, God already knows.
Yeah.
And you and I both have heard of prayer chains, in churches and in communities of faith. To me, that is almost laughable, because it presumes that there's some number that God has in mind, or that God isn't going to be satisfied with a prayer of one person. And I use the analogy of, can you imagine, and I'm a parent of two daughters, I can't fathom that, one of my daughters, when they were younger, would come to me and say, Dad, I'm sick. I need help. I need to go to the doctor. And I would say, come back and ask me again in an hour, or ask your friends to come and petition on your behalf. Right. And then when I am comfortable with the critical mass of petitioners, then I might take you to the doctor. No parent would behave like that. But that's how the God that is often depicted in Christianity behaves. It's, hey, prayers. And I see this on Twitter and Facebook. My friend has so-and-so. Please offer prayers that God will heal. And I want to say, are you effing kidding me? Do you really understand what you're asking for? And why does God even need to be asked? Because
I've seen it even worse than that. I've seen pictures of starving children or children with cancer, and it's like one like equals one prayer, or one share equals one prayer. And I'm just imagining some God who's sitting there on Facebook, capable of healing this child, but you needed 100 likes and you only got 98. So fuck your kid. And I think, okay, if a person did that, wouldn't you think there was something wrong with them? I'm sorry. If somebody that you actually, let's say a child that they have cancer, and I have a cure for cancer that's a single pill, wouldn't you think I was a dick if I didn't just give that person that pill? Now imagine if I had an infinite supply of it. it would really be worse of me to just not help your kid when I could. And okay, well, you didn't ask enough.
Yeah, I would say you would be a big dick and an asshole. And actually, if you read my book, so the last chapter before the epilogue is Shane, because you read it, is on the book of Job, and the title of that chapter is the book of Job, this God has a gambling problem and he's a dick.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a crazy story, because when I think of my understanding of Satan, and the story of Job, I just think it almost seems like Satan kind of tricked God into just letting him hurt Job. And like you said, the title of that chapter, this God has a gambling problem and he's a dick.
Yeah. So in the mythology of that day, the council in that mythology who roamed the earth looking for examples of righteousness. And so he approaches God, and the story says, and God says to Satan, "Hey, what do you think of my boy Job there? He's a righteous man." And the Satan goes, "Oh, the guy with a beautiful wife and children and camels and land? Yeah, it's because you've given him everything. Take those away, and he will curse you to your face." God says, "I'll take that bet." And then he lets the Satan utterly destroy this man's life. And so because the other worldview in that time was that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, that's what they believed. His friends came to him and said, "Come on, Job, just confess your sins. You've obviously done something to piss God off." And Job says, "No, I haven't." Job knows he's innocent. The reader knows he's innocent. God and the Satan know he's innocent. And so Job says, "No, I'm not going to confess anything. There's nothing to confess." And then when God finally shows up in the story, what does he say? "Where were you when I created the world, you little pissant?" And the Hebrew literally translates, "Take it like a man, brace yourself." So, that God is a dick. He allows this man's life to be destroyed, and then he rubs his face in it. When, any compassionate and benevolent God who took that bet and then realized his mistake would say, "Job, I'm sorry. I should never have let Satan fuck with you and destroy your life. Please forgive me." But no, this God behaves more like Trump than God, and it's a horrible story. And somehow it found its way into the Bible. It's part of what scholars call the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. So that would include Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, the Psalms. And these writers were pushing back on that prevalent notion that good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And this is a story that pushed back on that.
Yeah.
It's an awful story. How it made it into the Bible, I don't know, because it presents a very unflattering picture of God. And so you say, "Oh, but in the end, everything turned out okay. He got, new family, new land." Well, yeah, because the old ones are dead.
Right.
You can't put a happy ending on that story.
You can't. If you kill my dog and give me another one, that's not a happy ending because you gave me another dog. The point is that you killed my dog. That's the whole point. It doesn't make a difference.
For no good reason. Other than
no good reason.
And
I also wanted to add, it seems a little bit interesting that God took this bet to find out if Job would, remain loyal or not when he already knew.
That's a great point, and I didn't consider that when I was writing that chapter. But yeah, if God's omniscient, he would know what Job's motives were, and that he would know that Job was either purely and ultimately righteous and faithful, or that he wasn't. But no, he takes Satan up on the bet, and then the poor guy's life gets turned upside down.
Yeah, that's just another point. But one thing, so you were talking about this notion of a God who sees to it that good things happen to good people and the bad things happen to bad people. You talk about this being a lot more common in the first world than it is in places, like third world countries where bad shit actually just happens to everyone.
Well, I say that, the notion of a God who protects or a God, that blesses, it's mostly a first world, notion. Go to some third world country where children are dying. And oh, by the way, I think it's something like 3 million or 30 million children die of starvation every year. But go to one of those countries and tell them that God has a plan for your life, or that God's looking out for you and God will bless you. and that person might spit in their face if they have the saliva to do that.
Yeah, I like the way you worded that. They would spit in your face if they have the saliva to do it. That is.
Yeah, Leander Keck was the dean of Yale Divinity School many years ago, and he once said something to the effect of, "If it doesn't play in the cancer ward, it isn't the gospel." And so, imagine going into a cancer ward where children are dying of cancer and saying, "God has a plan for your life," or God is going to protect you and God is going to heal you. It doesn't play in the cancer ward, and if it doesn't play in the cancer ward, it's not the gospel, and quite frankly, it's not even a religion. It's a bad side of religion and life.
Yeah, and then it was you talked about in this chapter, from the Broadway musical, The Book of Mormon. There being a village in Uganda where everyone, people have AIDS, and there's just a lot of horrible things going on. And they all have this saying, and it's their prayer. Hasadiga Ibowai. I believe that's how it's pronounced. And you said, what does this mean? Hasadiga means fuck you, and Ibowai means God. So I guess Hasadiga Ibowai means fuck you, God. And it's still a prayer if you think about it. It's still an appeal. It's still a communication to this God. It's just reaching out and saying, fuck you, every time something bad happens. And it seems a lot more honest to, if you're going to thank God when good things happen, my kid just died, fuck you,
Absolutely. I put that in there, and number one, because the Book of Mormon is just a brilliant musical. But number two, most religious worship services, or Christian and Protestant, spend 90% of the time thanking God, praising God. We love you, we thank you, we praise you. But they never bring up the bad stuff. They let God off the hook. And I argue in my book that, where are the WTF prayers in church? Because you can't give God credit for all the good and then let him off the hook for the bad stuff. And so Mormon missionaries, are assigned to Uganda, where 80% of them have AIDS. They're dying of hunger, and life is pretty shitty. And actually, there's another song that goes like that. And but they have this prayer, if you will, that says "fuck you, God." And I make the argument: number one, that is a prayer, and number two, if there is a God, and that God can't handle such an honest and brutally raw prayer, then that's not much of a God. And if there is a God, I think that that God could and should be able to handle such honesty.
He should.
Whether it has an expletive, whether it's a FU prayer to God, again, a big God would say, yeah, it's pretty crappy. And my bad.
He should also be able to understand why someone would say that to him. He should have more than empathy to go like, okay, this person's cussing me out because they're, starving and their family just died. Like, even if there is some explanation, like, everything happens for a reason. There's something that makes that good that we just don't understand. Even if you have that, your God should understand why that person is feeling that way and why they would say the things they do. If somebody's particularly angry at me and they say some things that go way too far, if I did something really bad to them, I might not agree with a horrible thing they say, but that doesn't mean I can't empathize with why they're feeling that way about me, and then still kind of address it from that standpoint of like, okay, I did X to this person and they're saying this about me. How would I react if someone did that to me? I would probably do the same thing. It just seems like you would have some more understanding.
Yeah, particularly if you're the author of life. If you're the one that set everything into motion, then you are ultimately responsible for everything that happens in this world that you created. And you should be big enough and strong enough to take criticism of when things go bad. And even to the point of taking a FU prayer. I say if there is a God, that God can handle such honesty, it's not much of a God. But in the moments, in my more theistic moments, and where I posit possibly there is something beyond, I do hold out that whatever I, have said or would want to say to this God, that God at the end, if there is an end, would say, look, yeah, that was pretty shitty. I really screwed up there, and you had every right to say what you did.
Right.
I've often heard the definition of a friend is someone in front of whom you can think out loud. That's a true friend.
Yeah.
Well, if there's a God and you cannot think out loud or even silently with that God, that's not a God. I'm sorry. That's a small, weak, insecure God, and certainly not the God that we hear about as so strong and so pure.
Yeah, and if it's omniscient, this is one thing that I had to explain a lot in my in the rest of my deconversion process, was that if there is a God and he is omniscient, he knows everything, then if I think something negative, not saying it doesn't do anything for me. If I think God's an asshole, not telling God he's an asshole doesn't really help me out at all if he knows what I'm thinking anyway. So if I'm just going to pretend to worship him in hopes that I get to go to heaven for it, I mean, I'm hooked up to a lie detector test. He can see that I don't mean it. There's no point in lying to someone who's omniscient. So it only makes sense to be intellectually honest if you believe in something omniscient. And yeah, I think that's a brilliant point to touch on. And I do think that helps us kind of segue into the next topic. So I told you I wanted to talk to you today about the logical problem of evil and the many ways that it could be presented. I'm sure you've heard of the term theodicy. The theodicy is simply put, a justification response to the problem of evil. And like I said in my video, and you watched it before this, I don't think that the problem of evil disproves that there was an intelligent designer of the universe. So does the existence of evil prove there is no God? No, absolutely not. But if you propose a God to me who is omniscient, omnipotent, omnibenevolent, then the existence of evil absolutely disproves that your God exists, because it would be contradictory to say that evil could exist with a being who had all of these traits. And I noticed you have a debate coming up on the gospel truth with Marlon Wilson. And that is a great channel, whether the debates are debates between atheists and Christians, or they're between Calvinists and non-Calvinists, whatever. They debate several different ideas. I think that it's a good channel, whether you're religious or not, because you get to see the perspectives get put forward, argued against the other side. And I think Marlon's a pretty cool guy. So I think it's awesome that you're going to be on his channel having the debate. I will certainly be watching when you are. But what is it that you want to say about evil in that debate? If you could kind of give me a little bit of like what your take on that is.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with everything you said. Evil doesn't disprove God, but to me, I take a step back. God is not something to be proved.
Right.
It's just not, because if it could be proven, it would have been proven. So I actually, when I was invited to be on that show, he asked about this particular topic, and I said, well, I could probably think of 10 others, because I don't think God is something to be proved. But apparently he didn't get the message, so that's going to be the topic of the debate. But
okay.
we were talking about this before we went on the air. The problem of evil, it's a problem. It's a problem, and it should be a problem for believers. In fact, Bart Ehrman, who teaches Christianity at the University of North Carolina, Bart came out of Princeton when he got his PhD, and he was an evangelical Christian, and kind of saw his calling as being an evangelical professor in a state university. Bart eventually became agnostic, but not for the reasons that I talk about in my book, which for me, they were more academic. But it was theodicy, that problem of squaring evil and suffering with a good and gracious God. But I would say to the people who would say, well, does evil disprove God? Well, first of all, no, God is not something to be proved. But to those that would say, well, what do you do with the Grand Canyon? Go to see the Grand Canyon and tell me that there is no God. And I would say, well, go to the Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and go to the children's wing and then tell me about the Grand Canyon, or put those two side by side and tell me how you can say there is a God as you scrolled past kids that are going to die of cancer. So, the theodicy thing, it's gone back, centuries,
Right.
and it's something that has been debated by philosophers and theologians alike. For me, it does call into question the omnipotence of God, because if God is omnipotent, then evil should be vanquished. I mean,
Right.
if God is supreme, then why can't God vanquish evil unless you're willing to grant evil, whatever that is, an equal footing with God, or that evil, whatever in whatever form, whether it's personified in some demonic being, he has to be an equal being. Otherwise, why has God not vanquished it? So it's an interesting intellectual conversation and debate. It's not really that interesting to me. I do touch upon it in the book because I do think it's a subject that's worthy of discussion, and it's one that I think believers don't spend enough time talking about. And going back to the conversation we had about only focusing on the good things, I do think that believers, both Jewish, Christian, need to look at that honestly and come to conclusions, because I do think it's tough to reconcile the two. But I'm not going to ever say that evil disproves God, because God is to me something not to be proved.
So for me, when it comes to, if I talk about the problem of evil, a lot of theists who are not Christian, they simply reject one of the three traits of, omnipotence, omnibenevolence, omniscience. So they could say that God doesn't know something bad's going to happen, or they could say that God isn't omnibenevolent, so he has the power to do it, but maybe he isn't all good. And if you ever hear somebody say, like, God's a jealous God or something like that, they're kind of doing that same thing. And some people, they say he's all good, but he isn't all powerful. He can't stop it from happening. And that's really fine. If someone rejects one of those three, then I would say, well, the problem of evil, does nothing for whatever God you're proposing, if you're saying that. But when it comes to the people who do believe in the God who is omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, there are two theodicies that are the most common, and I want to get, I guess, your take on them. So the first one is called, I wonder if you've heard of it, it's called the free will defense. Basically, the idea, I wrote it down to word it better, but that God maximized goodness in the world by creating free will. And being free means that we have a choice to do evil things, and some of us exercise that choice. My criticism of it is that you're implying that God couldn't give us free will and there not be any evil. And that raises questions about the Garden of Eden and heaven. Is there free will in heaven? So that's kind of like my quick, simple response. But what is your thought on the free will defense? Anything other than what I just said?
Yeah, it's funny that you listening to you describe that, Shane. I remember a theological debate in like junior high school with a girl about free will versus determinism, and I've always found the notion of free will certainly more appealing than determinism, because as an agent, I exercise free will, or at least I think I do.
Right.
So I reject the notion of predestination or determinism. But there was a school of theology when I was a minister. I think it was called process theology, and it goes something like this: that God created the world and essentially let it run on its own, so that the force, nature has its own forces and freedom, humans have their own forces and freedom, and that God somehow limits God's self to intervene in the world. And that's kind of where I landed as a minister. It was kind of a combination of deism and the notion of free will. But even with that understanding of or view of the world, it still didn't work for me, because you can't reconcile that with God, the notion of God's omnipotence, and God's ultimate responsibility for whatever God created. So I do think that we are free beings. I don't think there's anything controlling me. Now, am I a product of my culture and climb and all of those things? Yes. I did not come to the me that's me in a vacuum. But I do exercise what I believe to be free will. I don't think there's anything controlling me. And nature certainly seems to be exhibiting a certain amount of free will. I mean, just look at what's happening in Texas, Shane, in your backyard with, sub-zero temperatures and snow and people dying. If that's nature exhibiting free will, okay. But ultimately, I'm not going to let God off the hook. I'm going to be the guy raising my hand at the end going, all right, what about COVID? Yeah, let's talk about COVID.
Right.
Or, just fill in the blank.
So that's one of the first criticisms that a lot of people have regarding the problem. Regarding the free will defense, is that even if free will does give us an explanation for moral evil, it doesn't give us an explanation or a justification for natural evil. And the difference in these things, moral evil, obviously evil committed by people, things that are morally wrong. Natural evil, things like what's going on outside, it's freezing out there, power is going out because of it. There are hurricanes, there are sandstorms, there are, all kinds of natural events that these are, called natural evil. You having this free will defense only if it excuses any kind of evil, which I don't think it does. If it does, it only excuses moral evil. It doesn't even address natural evil. So you still have that problem. And then the issue of, shouldn't there only be an amount of suffering necessary for us to learn from? If there's anything beyond that, that kind of makes the point against it.
Yeah, I probably, I don't necessarily use the language of evil to describe acts of nature. That's just me. I mean, I see nature as almost morally blind, and it's
yeah.
So I don't really use the language of evil to describe nature, but I still don't let the God that I don't believe in off the hook for acts of nature, because if I'm going to have that conversation with you, a believer, I'm going to take you on your home turf, meaning using your book, the Bible, using my observation of the world that I live in that's around me, and we're going to argue on that basis. And in that case, yeah, God is responsible for everything, including acts of nature. But I'm just not comfortable using the word evil to describe.
I generally speaking, I also would not use the word evil to describe things like hurricanes, like we talked about. I learned the term natural evil in a lecture I watched about philosophy, because when I saw natural evil, I had the same thought that you did. I don't really assign evil to nature, but what it really just means is natural means of bad things happening. So in the colloquial sense, when we say the word evil, what we're referring to is moral evil. In the philosophical sense, I guess it does make sense to have moral evil, which is what you and I would both understand the word evil to mean. Natural evil would be better described to someone less versed in philosophy as just suffering or just, catastrophic events.
But Shane, to go back to, the Bible, and the God that's depicted in the Bible comes close to evil. If you think about it, again, I don't want to relitigate the book of Job, but that God, when you destroy a man's life for no good reason, and then you rub his face in it and tell him, where were you when I created the world? I mean, yeah, that's a dick move, but that's borderline evil. The story of, where God asks Abraham to kill his son, Isaac, that's crazy. That's borderline evil, if not crazy. So again, when I have these conversations about the Bible, and this is your guide, I'm going to take you on using your book and the stories that are in that book. And that's where I would kind of get close to the line of saying the God in the Bible, at times is certainly not good. And you could argue that he gets really close to the evil side of the equation in some of the stories. I mean, the flood story. I was the kid to focus on the rainbow. Well, I didn't focus on the rainbow. I focused on the little children who died unnecessarily, or the animals that didn't do anything. I mean,
I found it really weird when I got older that I was like, hold on, I was given this story of him like flooding the world, 2 of every animal on an ark, managed by 8 people, because that's possible. But I wasn't like really, it was like, it didn't click to me that like God just killed everyone in the world. Like, then I got older, I'm like, oh yeah, remember that part of the Bible where God kills everyone? literally everyone except for 2 of every animal, and then 8 people. Remember that?
Yeah,
Huh.
and those penguins that were somehow in the Middle East. Yeah,
Yeah.
God took care of them.
Yeah. How penguins made it to the Middle East is just another mystery, I guess, you know.
Yeah.
So the another theodicy, I wanted to kind of get your take on this one. It's known as the soul making theodicy, and it's kind of put in this way that good can't exist without badness. You know, pleasure can't exist without pain. So, in other words, it's kind of like you can't know warmth if you haven't experienced cold. So, some people say that in order for God to be good, he has to have badness too. Um, do you think that that is in some way, shape, or form rejecting omnipotence? Because that's how I understand that to be.
Yeah, I just don't buy into the dichotomy or to the horns of that dilemma. Um, I don't know why someone would have to say for God to exist, there needs to be evil. For me to understand, warmth, I need to be cold. How about you just take, cold and evil and the crappy side of life out of the equation? If you're
Right.
God, demonstrate to me that you're God, show me, and then don't make me twist my mind into pretzels, trying to force myself to believe that kind of notion that you need opposites in the world. I mean, I get the argument. I've heard it. I've read it.
Yeah.
It just doesn't work for me.
Right.
Yeah.
I think it's a little bit more understandable. Like I could accept when I have days where I'm sad because it's like, okay, well, this will make me appreciate being happy more. But I don't claim to have the ability to not be sad at all. I don't claim to have the ability to only be happy. So if you're God, then you should be able to make a world where we can have good without bad, where we can have pleasure without suffering, where we can have warmth without cold. And to say that God couldn't do that is saying that there's something God couldn't do. And that is rejecting omnipotence. And a lot of
Yeah.
people kind of just don't want to accept the fact that you are dismissing omnipotence when you do that.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, if you look at the logic, at the pure logic of that argument, absolutely, logically, it absolutely challenges omnipotence, the God's omnipotence. I get that, and I would agree with that argument on its logical face.
Yeah. Okay. So something I wanted to ask you about in ministering, because we talked about concepts of hell, and one book that I have been meaning to read for quite a while. I will be reading it in the next few months and probably reviewing it on my channel. I want to know if you've heard about it. Have you heard of a book called The Apocalypse of Peter?
Was it part of either the apocrypha or the pseudepigrapha?
Yes, it was considered scripture for, I don't know, between 100 and 1,000 years. I know that's a pretty big gap. So, but for the first century it was, and then they kind of removed it from the Bible, removed it from scripture because it was really harsh. This is the book where our understanding of hell comes from, is how I've heard it described. And it's basically supposed to be a description of what the biblical hell would be like. But that book that has that description has actually been removed from the Bible. So
Yeah, I'm not that familiar with that particular book. Obviously, scholars have shown that the canon as we have it, the biblical canon, came together over, hundreds of years, and books were, books were out. There's thumbs up, thumbs down votes, and some books got in and some books didn't. But there was a book. I think it's in the pseudepigrapha, and I want to say it might have been the Gospel of Peter, but the name escapes me. But some of the stories don't. So in this particular book, Jesus as a kid, kills one of his friends because his friend pissed him off, and in a couple of other stories, he performs tricks and magic. That book didn't make it into the Bible for who knows what reasons. But if you do look at the books that made it, that's even more fascinating. So you still have a book that where he turns water into wine, feeds the 5,000 or whatever. Those stories on their face are incredible, and certainly from my perspective not true. But I'm not familiar with the particular book you referenced. But there were many books that did not make it into what we would today regard as the Bible.
Okay. Yeah, no, many. And I actually find that to be very interesting. It's like, huh, so this was written with the intent of it being part of the Bible, but then someone kind of decided, we don't want that in there. It seems a little bit interesting that that process even exists in a book being written that is, inspired by the divine. It doesn't seem like you would really need that. So I find that in itself to be interesting. But if we're able to stay in contact, when I'm done reading that book, maybe I could mail it to you or something like that. I'd love to discuss that book with you if both of us do get a chance to read it.
Yeah, I'll
Just
read.
be, yeah, just because of the fact one thing that makes it difficult is it's really hard for me to find translations of it in English, and when I do, they tend to be between $80 and $150. So I'm gonna have to just say fuck it and spend between 80 and 150 books on an English translation of the Apocalypse of Peter because I just want to read it that bad. So if I'm able to get a copy myself, I'll mail it to you so you don't have to spend anything like that on it. But
I wouldn't pay 80 cents
yeah.
like that. So I'll let you pick up the tab on that one. Sorry.
Yep, I got the tab for you, man. You've given enough money to the church and people who write religious books so far. So no, I'm certainly I look forward to that. I hope I'm able to get the book because for all I know, maybe I go to get it and they're just out of it in English or something like that. But should be able to get myself a copy. So everyone, before we get going and before we wrap up, I will give you a chance to give a few final thoughts. Want to plug his book one more time. Speaking of God, We Don't Know Shit. You can find it on Amazon. It's a great book. I told him before this live stream, I would put it in my top 3 books about atheism. It's up there with God Is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything by Christopher Hitchens and The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins. So for this to be within those 2 books, please consider reading it if you haven't already. It was a #1 bestseller for a very good reason. David, I do appreciate you being on here very much today. Is there anything that you wanted to wrap up with before we get going?
No, Shane, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed our time together. And thank you for the high praise for my book. It's humbling and still amazing that an unknown author like myself and first time author, could write a book that would even be mentioned in the same genre among literary giants like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris. It's amazing because I've read almost everything they've written. Their writings have shaped my thoughts, and yeah, it's just amazing to be included in the same paragraph with them. But so thanks for that compliment. I really appreciate it, and thanks again for having me on your show.
Absolutely. Right before I get going, I guess there was one thing I forgot to ask you. When I meet people who, I told you I became secular at 13, I became atheist at 17. When I talk to people who remained Christian into adulthood and they were, past their 30s when they became an atheist, I used to word it as, wow, you wasted the first half of your life, until I started looking at it differently. Do you feel like you wasted your life or wasted a big chunk of your time in being a minister and studying these things? Or are you still glad that you were a minister? Are you still glad that you had the path that you had?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer would be yes, Shane. It has nothing to do with religion or theology. It has to do with, I met the woman who would, become my wife when I was in graduate school at Duke, and that would not have happened if I were not there. And that woman, bore our children, and my daughters are as precious to me as anything. So that whole part of my life, had I not pursued that and pursued something else, I would not have my daughters. And so for that reason, I would absolutely do it again. If I could, if I knew that doing something else would still, bring me to the point where I would have my 2 daughters, I would do that. But I will say that it wasn't a total waste. I enjoyed what I did. I think I was very fit for ministry. I was good at it. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed the acts of ministry. I enjoyed reading and writing and speaking and being with people in the good times and the bad times. And I'll tell you, Shane, had I not gone through what some call a crisis of faith, I would still be a minister.
Right.
I certainly would be at a different income level had I stayed in ministry, and I've enjoyed my life post ministry, and if I started over and entered the world of technology, and I've done very well there. But no, I wouldn't change a thing, because changing a thing would mean that the outcome of my family would be so different, and for that reason, I would go back and do it again, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. That was actually exactly the type of answer I was hoping to get, and I guess my hopes were met in that. And I should also add, so as a 23-year-old, I just turned 23 less than a week ago. As a young atheist, us young atheist activists are very happy that not everyone who is in the atheist activist community is someone who deconverted at a young age. I'm very glad that there are people that I can talk to and interview like you who have been studying religion at, academic institutions for 10 years, because there certainly is going to be a lot about scripture that that I don't. And, young atheist activists can learn more because of the fact that there are so many people who are, upward of 40 that have actually been Christian most of their life. So for my own sake, I'm glad you were religious as long as you were, and for the sake of the future of atheist activism. But very glad that you don't feel like you wasted your life, because some people feel that way. Some people have told me that they envy me becoming an atheist at 17. They're like, man, I wish I just figured it out then.
I can't say that I don't wish I figured it out. I mean, because there's a part of me that does, and there's a part of me that's envious that you have. I will say this, though, Shane, I was lucky that my crisis of faith occurred when I was 35, and I was still relatively young, and I had a lot of my life ahead of me.
Right.
If it happened to me in my 40s or 50s, I don't know what I would have done, because there's a certain age beyond which it's tough to get a job in any field.
Yeah.
And so at 35, I was still relatively young. I was marketable. And I started life over. And the other side of that has been beyond what I could ever imagine, professionally, financially. And so I'm glad that it happened when it did, because there are I can tell you this, there are more ministers than you would know who are inches away from where I am in the conversations that you and I have been having, but they don't know what else they would do with their lives, because they've been doing this for so long. There's nothing else they can do. And so they rationalize, they kind of wink and nod and have this understanding with themselves. And to me, that's much more sad than, whatever I went through, that led to my leaving ministry. So no, I applaud you. Thank you for having a show that gives a voice to folks like us. I do think that it's a growing segment of our population, and all the latest religious surveys, the fastest growing demographic is nuns, N-O-N-E-S. I think we're a long way from agnostics and atheists being in a majority. I can safely say that in my lifetime, we will not elect an agnostic president, which is sad on so many grounds. But I am hopeful that, because of young folks like yourself and others who are giving voice to something that for doing what you are doing, Shane, and best of luck with your show and with your life.
All right, thank you. And I was tempted to say, when you were like, I'm glad that I deconverted at the age that I did. I was trying not to say, yep, God has a plan. He knew it. That's the age you needed to. But no, I think that similar to Christians who were like, oh, well, he has a plan, there's a reason for it. We can assign our own reasons to why that happened. Just as like, here's what it did for me. Here's why, like you said, you're glad you deconverted when you did. I'm glad that you are accepting of the time in which you did. And like you said, it's a lot difficult the older you get. If somebody is a 50-year-old preacher and this is what they've done for 20 years, it's a lot more difficult. And there are a lot more pastors who fit that description than both atheists and Christians really give credit for. There are plenty of atheist pastors and preachers to this day. So it's been a great discussion, man. Please be safe. I will try to be, but I'm in Texas, so no promises.
All right. Stay warm. Stay safe. Thanks, Shane.
All right. You too. Take care.